Just a few days ago, President Biden ended the longest war in U.S. history. But what was accomplished? What was the success? And what is the impact on America domestically and our standing internationally? This is Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Claville. And stay tuned as we analyze Afghanistan, the legacy. Welcome back. This is Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, and we want to thank you so much for joining us once again on this beautiful Sunday. For all of our students across the country that are started their first week or first day or getting ready to start school at universities, we wish you nothing but success. And we wish especially those here on the campus of Norfolk State University, home of the Spartan Nation. We've gotten off to a great start, and we're looking for us to end just as strong as we started. Also, I'd like to thank all of our supporters for supporting Save the Water as we are now getting ready to go into our second season. How phenomenal it's been to actually come to you every single week to talk about issues that are affecting you in the community. So we're grateful, and we couldn't do it without you. And I want to take a moment and pause here in order to think about all of those impacted by Hurricane Ida. Now, of course, Hurricane Ida entered into my home state. And, of course, now the storm and tropical storm is going across the country and should enter out past New York and back into the ocean. But those individuals that were impacted, those homes and properties that were destroyed, lives that were lost, I want you to know that our hearts, our prayers, our thoughts are with you. You know, we are stronger together. And as a nation, we're coming together, helping, throwing in what we can in order to help rebuild, help to mend, and help you to rise from those ashes of that storm. Again, our hearts go out to you, and, of course, our prayers. So we're looking for them to be stronger, Marvin. And we're looking for our country to be better for it. So on this Closer Look series, we're taking a look at the legacy of Afghanistan. Now, we know that this was the longest war in the U.S. history. And it was a war that a lot of us have various opinions about. And we're going to delve into it. We're going to talk about, not just the war itself, how it started. We're also going to take a look and talk about the current relationship, the cost of it, but also the impact on the Black, brown, and poor communities in what we call endless wars. And then how do we measure success from this and the various lessons learned? But before we do that, I want to take a part of this show just to honor all of the men and women, the brave soldiers across our country and our territories who fought in this war, who aided our military in order to get them ready to go into this battle. And a lot of times we forget about how war started. We're going to talk about it, but no matter how wars start or how wars end, there's one constant, and that's the bravery of our military. When you think about it, especially being in Hampton Roads, we have one of the greatest communities of current and former military. That's what makes Hampton, one of the things that make Hampton Roads so wonderful. But also across the country, we have military bases. We have families that give their loved ones to the service of our country through military service. I'm a third generation veteran myself, on my father's side. My father and then my grandfather, my father's father served. And we understand and know what the sacrifice is. But even those that gave the greater sacrifice, those that gave their lives, just recently, as we were evacuating people out of Afghanistan, unfortunately, a suicide bomber cost 13 Americans and many other Afghanistan citizens their lives. Even in going out of the country, leaving the country, lives were lost. They gave the ultimate sacrifice. And we've got to honor all of those veterans, all those military personnel that did so, not just in this war, but those that were attacked on our soil during 9/11, those that fought in all the other wars across our nation's history. So if I could, I'd just like to take a few moments to honor them with a moment of silence. Thank you for your sacrifice. So when we talk about Afghanistan, what comes to mind? There's a lot of things in the news right now. We see press conference after press conference. We see this vehicle and this airplane flying off and driving in. We see criticism, constructive criticism. We see support. And one thing that's left out of all of this is how did this war start in the first place? We just knew we were in Afghanistan and being over there for over 20 years. Some of the soldiers that fought in that war were not even born when we went into the country. And some were just teenagers or just born, actually, when we went over there. I was speaking with someone and their son was enlisted in the military, and the mother said, my son is going to go over to fight the same war that his father, her husband, fought. And I scratched my head on that. I said, wow, we're talking over 20 years later. And you sent your husband, now you're sending your son. That's amazing. So we have this concept called endless wars. And we're going to delve into it in the second half of this show, when we start to take a look at the impact that this has on the Black community, poor communities. And how do we measure success and what are our lessons learned from this? So let's take a look at history. You guys know that you listen to the show, history is very important. I believe it's the foundation of all that we do, because first you got to understand how something was before you can understand how it could be. So the war in Afghanistan was actually called Operation Enduring Freedom. And it began really in October and in 2001 in a response to September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. And from that point on, the U.S. started to fight this group called the Taliban, even in various militias and warlords and the like. But even going a little bit further, after 9/11, we understood that there was an enemy of the state, public enemy number one, named Osama bin Laden. And after the strikes the terror strikes here on our soil, September 11, 2001, we saw so many lives lost in that one attack, the worst domestic attack of our country, hands down. I mean, we saw the Twin Towers as they came down. I remember driving into the office, and I remember hearing a news break saying there's a report that their plane has flown into the World Trade Center. And they said, we don't know much now, but we'll get back to you with more updates. When I got to the office, because it took me 8 minutes at that time to get to the office, trust me, I used to love those days. But when I got to the office, I heard the latest report in what was going on. They said, we believe our country is under attack here in the city of New York. And then more reports came out about other airplanes and what was happening there. And I remember announcing my office, I said, guys, I believe we're under attack in our country. And we turned the news on, and there it was. So with that, we had to give a response. And that response was for us to hunt down those individuals responsible for that attack and ensure that it doesn't happen again. So that's when we began sweeping measures to go into Afghanistan in order to bring Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, to justice. Now, we also know that it took years, over a decade and a half to over a decade to actually complete that mission. And that mission was completed during President Obama's administration. But going into Iraq was under and during President Bush's administration. So when we went there, we went, of course, to hunt down Osama bin Laden, fight the terrorists that were there, but also to be able to stabilize the country. Now, this is part of our foreign policy. When we go into certain countries, of course, we help to rebuild, but also where there's no democracy or where there's a lack of stable government, we tend to be there to implement or stabilize the government. So in December of 2001, we started an interim government where Hamid Karzai was placed in as the president of that particular country. And after that, the Taliban actually collapsed. So there was roughly a lot of stability during that time period, and where we were then establishing not just a stable government, but we also were establishing goodwill, because we started to help to build. We started to help to construct schools and roads and things of that nature. And keep in mind, a lot of those individuals in those countries actually live under a lot of terror, right? I mean, a lot of their freedoms they don't have as we have here. So we feel as if a country, if a people had certain freedoms like we have, things would be better. But some people think that other cultures agree with the way that they run their countries. You know, of course, that's an ideological and philosophical and political debate that can go on and on and on. What are your thoughts on it? You know, should we interfere with other countries and how they have their people to live, or should we impose our will? Again, that is always going to be a discussion and always a debate on how we move forward. But this is what we did in Afghanistan. And in 2003, major combat had ended. And this, I'm looking at a timeline here, timeline of the war in Afghanistan. And under this timeline, it shows how the war started, what we actually did when we went inside, and the Council on Foreign Relations. By the way, you can view this timeline on Council on Foreign Relations website, cfr.org. That's cfr.org. This is the premier agency within the United States that actually advises on relationships and policies with our international partners. So with this, we started the construction. New president of Afghanistan came in. They elected their own president, a free and fair election. And this is 2004. And I'm going through this timeline because I wanted you to see how fast this whole experiment collapsed, which is some of the criticism that is out there. And then, of course, in 2005, we had a commitment to this enduring freedom. But in 2006, we had a resurgence in terrorism. We had a resurgence in violence erupting across the country. And then our coalition with a lot of the members that we had across the world started to fracture. And then from that, we started to experience a lot more tragedies upon the women involved, those citizens. But then in 2009, President Obama recommits to Afghanistan with a new American strategy and calling for NATO to come in to help with this new strategy. But we found that we had a new strategy, but we were fighting the same old wars, the same old battle. So again, a new Afghan president comes in. We have a surge in Afghanistan. And even with this, we find that we're able to stabilize the country again. And on May 1st, 2011, keep in mind, September 11, 2001, and May 1st, 2011. It took that long, and on that day, Osama bin Laden was killed. That was something that went across the screen, across the world. We saw that. Marvin, we saw the Situation Room, and we saw when our brave Navy SEALs went in and executed the promise of our former president during the term of our President Obama. So then in 2011, we have a troop drawdown, where we started to bring troops out because we felt that the country was able to stand. And we see where in 2012, the Taliban canceled their talks and the U.S.-Afghan tensions flared up again. And then, of course, after that, President Obama announces more troop withdrawals in 2014. The government starts to form, but then it starts to fracture. And we have U.S. attacks that take place. And then President Trump comes in and he launches he says that we're going to have a prolonged war in Afghanistan. And then the Taliban in 2018 start to launch more and more attacks, even as U.S. and Taliban talks progress. But then in 2019, President Trump called off the peace talks. And this is a key point. In 2019, President Trump called off the peace talks and the negotiations with the Taliban leaders. And from this, the Taliban says it's committed to continuing negotiations, but they warned that the cancellation will cause an increase in the number of deaths. But in 2020, the U.S. Taliban signed a deal on a path to peace. But then, after that, the U.S. announces troop withdrawals, and President Biden decides to complete troop withdrawals before 9/11, again in 2021. And in August 15 of 2021, the Afghan government collapsed as the Taliban takes Kabul. That in less than 1 year after the peace talks, the government collapsed. This is Say the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, and you're listening to WNSB Hot 91 here on the campus on Norfolk State University. Here, we're taking a closer look at the legacy of Afghanistan. We're peeling back and looking at the history of Afghanistan, looking at why the war started, what took place during the war period, and how it actually ended. Also, in the second half hour, we're going to take a look at the impact of these endless wars on the Black and brown and poor communities. And also, what are the lessons we can learn for the future? And how do we measure success? So in less than a year after a peace talks were called off and a deal was signed, the Afghan government collapsed. It collapses. How can a government that was trained, that was provided, and we're going to talk about the cost in a moment here, but how can a government that was trained by U.S. soldiers, also government officials received training, they elected their own leader, they were given many, many resources that many people here in our country don't have, and that's one of the criticisms as well. How does it collapse? Within days, not months, not years, not decades, but days of the U.S. announcing and participating in bringing out troops. To me, It's astonishing. It's baffling. But it also shows the principle. This is what happens when you fight for persons that don't want to fight for themselves. Even on a larger scale or a small scale, it's the same principle, and you get the same result every time. But also, did we go about it the right way? So let's take a look at the cost. The cost of this war. So we were over there for over 20 years. Well, right at 20 years. And we're there, well, I would say a few days short of 20 years because we left before 9/11/2021. So with that, we didn't spend $1 billion. We didn't spend $10 billion. We didn't spend $100 billion. We didn't spend $1 trillion, but we spent $2 trillion investing in this country that fell in less than 30 days. $2 trillion invested in this country that fell in less than 30 days. We're gonna delve into where that $2 trillion went, but the cost of the war itself is astonishing. $2 trillion, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of taxpayer money. Because that money comes directly out of the coffers of the tax base of our citizens, you and I, everyone that's listening, and it goes to pay for that debt. Now, of course, that debt is paid for through taxation or monetization. And I'm not going to get into what is monetizing. I mean, that's a whole nother issue, concept. It's very fascinating when we talk about the stock market, when we talk about bonds, when we talk about the Treasury, when we talk about Federal Reserve, when we talk about various instruments that we can utilize in order to wrap debt and spending up so our country can continue to operate the way it does. But I digress. But $2 trillion, Marvin, that's a lot of money. That's right. So what do we get for $2 trillion? We got, now, of course, again, we understand why we went into Afghanistan. It was a response from 9/11. It was a response to an attack on our American soil. It was a response to the rest of the world to show that America is strong, and you do not, I repeat, you do not attack America on its own soil and expect to get away with it. That's the resolve of the American spirit. That's the resolve of the American heart. That's the resolve of American strength. So it was, if anyone is saying it wasn't the right move for that, it was. But then what happened after we got there? So we started, of course, with the military. We have to, it costs money. Every time you fit out a soldier, uniform, Kevlar, body armor, rifle or sidearm if you're an officer, boots, undergarment gear. And also, then, of course, if it's eyewear and things of that nature, canteens or water backpacks that we have now, ammo, cartridges, the whole nine, flashlights, if they issue grenades, depending on what type of rifle you have, M16, M2, M203, whatever it may be, that costs money. Then to feed the soldiers, transport various vehicles, Humvees, tanks, deuce and a half, 5 tons, HEMTTs, and the various different types of HEMTTs that we have, those that haul, those that are cranes that you pull other vehicles with, fuelers, whatever it may be, airplanes to fly soldiers there, also jets in order to fight. All of that costs money, and we're talking millions of dollars. And when you add that up, now it adds up over not just a year, but 20 years that we had to outfit soldiers, keep them maintained, fuel in those vehicles, enough ammunition and the like, and also to maintain a base there. So it costs money to operate that. Now, that is the cost of war. We understand that. That's the cost of freedom. That's the cost of being able to operate the way we do in America. That's the cost that I think all of us are willing to pay. But the other part of that, we built roads, we built schools, we built in the places for individuals to be educated. We helped to build homes. We helped to provide infrastructure for clean water, electricity, and the like, sewage, and so forth. So we leave all of those great things that we did behind, but we invested in a country that now goes back to the enemy that we were fighting when we first got there. It goes back to a group of people that helped to breed the terrorism or the terrorists that were there, gave them the opportunity to breed the Al-Qaeda and their leader, Osama bin Laden, and many others. So when we take a look at what we did, but what we're leaving behind, I think we all have to agree there was a misstep. So what are those missteps? Is it lack of being able to understand the culture of the people? The lack of being able to understand the history of what other countries tried to do during colonialism and other wars that took place in what is today Afghanistan and in that region? Is it lack of a plan, a long-term plan? Or is it just something that just happens? Well, it can't be something that happens because others have said that Afghanistan, this is our Vietnam. Because remember, we left Vietnam very, very similarly. We had planes coming in, getting people from the embassy, flying out, and then after we picked up the last persons, we pushed those planes into the ocean and we sailed off. Go back and take a look at the video. That's right. Go back and take a look at the videos. You know, that war lasted, from the, late 50s to the early 70s. So that was our example of what not to do. But it looks like we did it again. So what do we get for $2 trillion? What is now the relationship with the U.S. and the Taliban moving forward? What's the impact of President Donald Trump, former president, canceling the peace talks? What is the impact of our current situation moving forward? What's going to happen with all those military vehicles that were left behind when the Army dropped their weapons and fled instead of standing and fighting for their country? This all adds to the legacy of Afghanistan. But the question becomes, were they fighting for their country or were they fighting for a country that we thought they should have? Were they fighting for their country or were they fighting for a country that we thought that they should have? Again, I think it makes all the difference to understand the people, to understand the culture, and to understand how we actually deal with the world moving forward. But we want you to stay tuned because we're going to take a commercial break in just a moment, and we're going to delve a little deeper into Afghanistan and the legacy of it. We're going to take a look at the impact on the Black and brown community of these endless wars. Also, how do we measure success? And what are the lessons we can learn in the future as we go into other countries and as we defend our freedoms, both domestically and internationally? You're listening to State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, where we bring movers, shakers, and policymakers to you to discuss issues that are important to the community. Continue to listen as we talk about and delve into Afghanistan, the legacy. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. This is Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. Thank you again for joining us again for our Closer Look series as we delve into Afghanistan, the legacy. We also like to again welcome all of you to the campus of Norfolk State University. Those of you who are starting or coming back to finish your college education, remember, it is worth it. So we wish you here in the Spartan Nation and all across the country, all universities across the country, all the HBCUs, we wish all of you nothing but success. Because if anything, we know that you can do it. And when you get out, you'll be better for it and you'll make an indelible impact in this world. As we start to take a look at the first half of Afghanistan, the legacy, we start to look at the history first. to understand why this war took place, why we went into it, and then the cost of the war. So we understand that we went in because in answer to 9/11. Once again, we went in order to tell the world, show the world that terrorism will not win. Now, there is a discussion about not just international terrorism, but domestic terrorism. Now, we'll talk about that later in another show, but we're going to deal with the international terrorism now. But we went over there and we accomplished a mission of seeking out, hunting down, and killing Osama bin Laden. Also, many other individuals that helped to plan various terrorist attacks across the world for U.S. interests, not just here on our domestic soil. And we also helped to build a nation, not rebuild it, but build a nation. And we fought the group called the Taliban. This was the group controlling Afghanistan. We also fought several militias, and we fought various warlords. But after fighting them to take control, 10 years after that, and killing Osama bin Laden in 2011, we found again a resurgence in the Taliban, a resurgence in the killings and the terrorist attacks upon our soldiers in Afghanistan. At the same time, we're committing over $2 trillion into Afghanistan, over $2 trillion. I said again, over $2 trillion into the country of Afghanistan. That actually folded in 30 days, less than 30 days after we announced our withdrawal of troops. Less than 30 days, it folded. So I posed a question in the last half hour, and I'll pose it now. Were we building a country, and did they fail to fight for a country that we thought they should have, or did they fail to fight for a country that they didn't want to have? That's the question. So in the second half hour, we're going to start to delve into and look in how do we measure success? What are those lessons from the past? But first, I want to talk about the impact of endless wars in this Afghanistan war on our Black and brown communities. So when we talk about war, many times we have leaders of countries. And before the election of our first Black president, again, I said first, and the re-election of our first Black president, because I believe there's going to be many more, the leaders of the countries, our country and others that have waged war against each other have been not representative of Black nations. And these special interest groups all around also have their interests. And we're talking about a small group of people, a small group of individuals that cannot agree upon one policy or the other. I mean, that's really how wars take place, because you have individuals that come to the table. Maybe one group wants a larger interest than the other, and they're not willing to budge, and then we go to war. Well, never do those leaders of the countries go to war. Never do they pick up a rifle. Never do they pick up a sidearm. Never do they go onto the battlefield and actually do battle. That day is over with. But what they do is they send brave men and women of our U.S. Army, our U.S. military. Now, with that, we know that a lot of those soldiers that enlist, they enlist not only for an opportunity to serve, an opportunity for a better life, but they also enlist for an opportunity to help to defend our nation and ideas. And a lot of those individuals come from communities that are Black, that are brown, and that are poor. You know, many times, and again, this is not saying that other groups do not serve in the military. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that there is a disproportionate impact upon Black and brown communities and poor communities that actually go to these wars and fight. And when we talk about going to these wars and fighting, we're talking about these individuals that go and they sacrifice. They're usually enlisted. They're usually individuals of low rank, maybe a E1, E2, E3, E4, and maybe an E5, which is a sergeant, a non-commissioned officer, the first step. But many of them are not at the sergeant level. And these are the foot soldiers. These are the individuals going to give their lives. These are the individuals that are going to fight for the ideas of America. These are individuals that are giving their life, Marvin, in order to fight for something that we didn't do, two men couldn't agree on. Is it fair? So what is the impact upon those communities? Well, the impact is that when first of all, there are some that give the ultimate sacrifice. They're the first to go in. So their lives are gone. Now, their lives are given for a great cause. They are honored and should be honored all for all the days of this country. And when we do honor our veterans, when we do honor those that are fallen, we can't do enough to honor them, hands down. I'm a third-generation veteran. Myself, my father, and my father's father, my grandfather, we all served. So we understand the sacrifice, and we understand why people do it. And it's something that I believe is a great, great work to do. And I wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. But some gave the ultimate sacrifice. Now, those that come back from those wars, they come back many times broken. They didn't die physically on the battlefield, but a part of them died. A part of them is struggling. And then they suffer with what's called Ptsd. That's the injury that you don't see. Or they suffer from various traumatic injuries such as being burned, losing a limb, head trauma, and the like. They suffer terribly. So when that happens, they bring it back to the community. They bring it back to their homes. They bring it back to their spouses, to their loved ones. They bring it back to their community. They bring it into their education. They bring it back into their everyday lives, and they have to deal with that struggle over and over again. So in a community that's already not as stable as it should be because of historical discriminatory policies and racism that has helped to cripple it, and also the effects of those policies in causing the individuals that live in those communities to inflict harm upon themselves. And what I mean, when you flood drugs into a community, when you flood illegal guns into a community, then you get high use of illegal guns, you get high use of drugs, and then you see the destruction from that. So when you bring our brave men and women back into those communities, that's part of the struggle. And when it happens at a disproportionate rate, then the communities themselves become crippled. So when we talk about going to war, when we talk about fighting for freedom, freedom comes with sacrifice. There's a physical sacrifice in giving your whole life, and there's another sacrifice in not just giving your time, but also sacrificing your sanity, sacrificing your peace, sacrificing even your ability to operate fully in the country because of the injuries that you have. So what can we do as it relates for better policy so that this won't happen again, so that we can actually learn from it? Now, you're going to get some degree of injury, some degree of death. We understand it. But what can we do to help support so that we can lessen that amount and we can lessen the impact, not just on us, but also in the countries where these wars actually take place? Now, talk about the impact on Black and brown and poor communities domestically to go fight the war. But now I want to talk about the impact of these endless wars on Black and brown and poor communities in where we actually go fight. So let's take a look at the country of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is is what we call a brown or nation or Black nation. It's a nation that is not wealthy. It's a nation that's poor. It's a nation where the education level is very low. It's a nation where employment rate is extremely low. It's a nation where you don't have a lot of opportunities. So when we take a look at the country of Afghanistan, or we take a look at other countries in which we've waged war in those areas and fighting for our interests or others, we see that there is carnage left behind. we see the bombs going off. And you think about it. You may hear, there are some people that hear gunshots in their community on a daily basis or fairly often. But there are nations in those communities where they hear bombs going off all the time. That's right, Marvin. All the time. And when they hear that, there's a type of shell shock, there's a type of PTSD that you get from that. There are children that are growing up hearing bombs drop over and over and over again. There are families that are broken because someone has died or stepped on an IED or been shot, or maybe they were mistaken for the enemy. So these are all issues that when we take a look at the impact of these endless wars, we just can't take a look at ourselves, because we don't fight these wars by ourselves, but we fight it in the midst and amongst and with the help of our allies in those nations. So what can we do to help lessen the impact, the disparate impact upon those individuals in the country? Now, we found where we were airlifting many of our allies of Afghanistan out with us. I mentioned in the first half of the show that Afghanistan is really our Vietnam. This is our time of Vietnam, because the evacuation of Vietnam before the Communist Army of Northern Vietnam came into South Vietnam, we were scurrying and hurrying to get our American citizens out, but also our allies. They were airlifting people out. And then after they airlifted them, they pushed the helicopters into the ocean and then left. And the nation of Vietnam is as it is today. And we'll talk about how those relationships were developed, but with that country now and how it can be developed when we talk about measured success in just a moment as it relates to Afghanistan. But we tried to airlifted individuals out of Afghanistan, and now there's a debate on where do we resettle these people. But they helped us. They were our interpreters. They were our lookouts. They were our soldiers that helped American soldiers. They were those that sacrificed their lives, their reputation, their safety in order so that our soldiers can be safer. So we've got to, and I say it again, we have to create a policy that helps them and doesn't leave them behind. And by ending endless wars, by having a targeted focus on what we're doing and why we're doing it, that will help us to lessen the impact, the disparate impact, the disproportionate impact upon Black, brown, and poor communities, both here domestically of our soldiers that go fight the wars, and upon the citizens of the countries of where the war is actually fought. We got to think on both ends. You listen to Stay of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, here broadcasting on WNSB Hot 91 on the campus of Norfolk State University, home of the Spartan Nation. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us as we peel the covers back and take a closer look at Afghanistan, the legacy, why the war started. Why did we stay so long? What happened while we were there? What did we build? And why the sudden collapse? And now we take a look at the impact, the disparate impact, disproportionate impact upon Black and brown communities, both here fighting and also in the countries where we fight. And now we're going to take a look at how do we measure success and what can we learn for in the future. Our producer, Marvin Folks, and I, we've been talking in how this war is really, for us, hopefully it could be our example moving forward in how we actually fight smarter wars and hopefully avoid fighting wars, right? More economical, because we spent over $2 trillion in a country that collapsed in less than 30 days. But also, how do we now help to build goodwill by not destroying the country and working with the people there so that they can build a better life for a country that they want and not one that we think that they should have. So when we talk about relationships, how do we measure success? Relationships is one of them. So now the Taliban has taken over again because we were fighting the Taliban before, and now they're back again. So this is the ruling faction. This is the ruling government here in Afghanistan. I think they're called the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So they're ruling based upon their religious beliefs. However, whether they are extreme, radical, or orthodox or liberal, that is the way that they're ruling. They're also ruling with their military. And they're ruling in a way that some believe actually is against or diametrically opposed to our democracy and what we were trying to instill. But they also are now ruling with our weapons and our military vehicles and our infrastructure that we left behind and that the Afghanistan army actually dropped. They didn't want to fight for it. They did not want to fight for it. And listen, that's a head scratcher there. And that's something that's a principle within itself. Do we fight for people, or do you fight for a nation or a country that don't want to fight for themselves? I think that's something we can also learn moving forward. But it's also reported that in negotiations, we started negotiating with the Taliban for peace talks on over several years prior to this. And during President Trump's time, he actually called off the peace talks with the Taliban. He called it off. We took a look at the Council for Foreign Relations website, and there you can look at it at cfr.org. That's cfr.org. And take a look at the timeline of our time in Afghanistan. And there are a lot of things that we could have learned from it, and hopefully we have. But calling off peace talks is not a good one. But we called it off, even though the Taliban said that they were still willing. And now we see where a peace treaty was signed, a peace deal was signed. And then President Biden announced that he would continue to do troop drawdowns to the point where we would withdraw our troops from Afghanistan and allow the country of Afghanistan to rule themselves. Well, as we see, the Taliban is ruling. So what do we do? What do we do? We have to build strong relationships across the board with not just countries and their people, but their leaders. So if the leader of the country, the ruling faction, is the Taliban, do we build strong relations with them? I mean, they were rumored to give safe passage to American citizens to the airport, even helping to get American citizens or our interests to the airport in Kabul to allow us to fly them to safety. So we see that if that is true, and taking a look at those reports that were reported out over our main news outlets, then it's true that we can build relationships. I mean, we did it with Vietnam. We did it when we left Vietnam. We can do it now. We built relationships with Japan, where they're one of our greatest allies after World War II. Now, we still don't have, good relationships with North Korea, but we're still there. We're still working it out. We built doable relationships with Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. We built a strong relationship with our mother, Great Britain, after we went through the American Revolution and split from them to have a country to stand on our own. We built strong relations with Cuba after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we continue to build strong relations with countries that we fought against or they fought against us. And as time passes, we understand where our interests start to merge together. And we want the same thing: peace, tranquility, and the pursuit of happiness. So it can be done. But if we know that we can build strong relations with even a government like the Taliban, as we have done throughout our history, then what do we now do moving forward? What are some of these lessons that we can learn in the event we have to go through another Afghanistan? Again, if we have to go through another Afghanistan, hopefully we want to prevent it. So when we talk about nation building, when we talk about moving toward a world that respects each other, first, I believe that as Americans, we have to understand other nations' cultures. And we have to understand other nations' ways and ideologies. Many times, if we impose our way, people fight against it. But we, at the same time, we have to ensure that what we do, that people respect us, no matter what. I think the second thing that we also have to do is continue to utilize our negotiation in our State Department, what we call soft power. It's just as effective because I think it's more, I think it does more good to stop a bomb from dropping than to drop multiple bombs. And that's what soft power does. And Marvin's back here shaking his head. You know, if I can negotiate with you and just sit at a table and talk with you and say, hey, before you drop that bomb, let's talk about your issues. And if we can prevent that and prevent us from dropping multiple bombs, I think it's a win. I think it's a win. So utilizing our soft power more through the State Department, through our wonderful men and women that serve valiantly, just like our men and women that serve in the U.S. military, because we're all working together. Thirdly, I think continue to build our relationships with our allies across the world. Many times when we fight these wars, well, not many times, but every time we fought a war, it has been on other soil. We've never fought a war on U.S. domestic soil against a foreign enemy after the American Revolution. So since the U.S. Constitution has been created, we have not fought an enemy, a foreign enemy, on our soil. Now, we have fought wars on our soil. It's called a civil war. We fought ourselves. And some people would think that we're fighting ourselves now, you know, with this mask mandate and other things, and misinformation. So I think that as we take a look at where we're fighting these wars, let's build those relationships with our neighbors to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, and our allies to understand and to build a greater understanding of that region, that people, and whether we should go into and fight that war. Next, I think we also should look at how long we stay. If we have to go to war, it's unfortunate, but if we have to, how long do we stay? What do we provide? What do we give? What do we get back for our investment? Some would say a few days shy of 20 years and $2 trillion. We didn't get that much. Marvin, what do you think? You know, again, I scratched my head. $2 trillion. $2 trillion for a government that folded in less than 30 days. What is the return on that investment? Or is the Taliban going to utilize this material now against the U.S.? This is going to be fertile ground for the breeding of other terrorists. What happens next as we now start to take a look at building other nations? Did we waste our time? Did we waste our efforts? Will we spend as much money? And for nations that really want it, will we use this as this failure as an example to say, no, we can't do it because of what happened in Afghanistan? These are all questions that we have to ask ourselves. And these are all issues that we have to deal with if we're going to learn from Afghanistan. Finally, I think when we learn our lessons and take a look at the legacy of Afghanistan, I want to go back to the investment. $2 trillion is a massive investment in anything. When we take a look at what we got from it, Marvin, many would say that we didn't get much for it. Many would say that unfortunately, lives were lost, and they would start to question whether the lives that were lost got the maximum for their lives. Well, I'll tell you this. When you put that uniform on, when you go defend this country, and you make the ultimate sacrifice, it is the max. And we honor them all the days of this country. So I salute you. I salute all the men and women. So I think that argument doesn't hold. But I want to take a look at what can be done domestically with $2 trillion. There have been others that have said, well, we could have completed our mission in Afghanistan and invested more money here in our communities, Black and brown communities in America. We built schools in Afghanistan that the Taliban may not use, but how many of our schools here in the country, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, are failing, structure-wise? How many schools need to be rebuilt? Some would say that we invested into roads and infrastructure that could be used here. Now, one thing that COVID-19 and the pandemic showed, it showed that we have flaws in our communities, our infrastructure. Many people couldn't even get online to learn because they didn't have Wi-Fi, broadband, and the like. Now, thank goodness for this infrastructure bill that's coming, and is going to invest in our country, in our communities, something that's needed. Because when you invest in people, in education, that's the greatest investment you can make. The greatest investment that you can make. So for $2 trillion, we could have got better schools. For $2 trillion, we can get better roads. For $2 trillion, we can get better infrastructure. For $2 trillion, we can end hunger. For $2 trillion, we can give the next generation a brighter future and a brighter start. That's what we can use our future monies for. But in closing, I want to just say that no sacrifice that our men and women made was in vain. We honor them, we salute them, and because of you, our country is greater and safer. This has been another closer look here on Save the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. We want to thank you again for joining us on this Sunday. And if you miss any shows, you can go to our social media and check it out. We'll see you next week. God bless.